another session of the Skull Sessions podcast. And today, my guest is Tamika Thompson. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, Tamika. So this is like the probably the start of every podcast is tell me a little bit about yourself.
About myself. Well, I was born and raised in Michigan, in Detroit. I've lived in New York, LA, Chicago, and now I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. My background was in journalism, and probably about a decade ago, I started writing professionally and sold some short stories and thought I was going to be by day a journalist and by night a literary writer, but everything that I was writing was coming out very dark.
Right.
So I kind of went in that direction, and more recently, worked on a couple of books that are squarely in the horror genre. And a few years ago, joined the Horror Writers Association.
Are any of those books out now?
They are. So for Halloween last year, Madness Heart Press did a re-release of my novella, Salamander Justice. We originally had published that book in 2020, but it was right as the pandemic was, the lockdowns were happening.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the release date, I think, was like the day after George Floyd was killed. So it was like, there was just no way I could promote that book.
There's a lot of other ditch and other things. So
I was in survival mode, I was just trying to stay alive. And so we put that back out last Halloween. And it's a horror novella. It's got a little bit of a love triangle, and it's a creature feature as well. It takes place in Hawaii. And earlier this year, from Unnerving Books, I put out a short story collection called Unshod, Cackling, and Naked. And it brings together 13 of my tales, and some of them are a little sci-fi, but mostly horror. There are a couple that are horror, but not speculative. So it has a bit of a range. But I think the thing that kind of ties it all together is that they are all contemplating violence. My background as a journalist, I studied violence. I had done some research on it and how it plays out in the United States. And I think that comes up in my work,
Do you study more like groups of people and how they interact with others, or individual cases, or what do you focus on?
So as far as the research, I was really looking at youth violence. And at the time I was not
like gang violence.
So that's included, but also school shootings, mass shootings that are perpetrated by young people, ranging in the ages from about 10 to 24. And the research that I was doing was actually for a documentary that never ended up happening. But sometimes I think in
why
life,
did it never happen? How did they go?
It wasn't the right the group that I had brought together to do it wasn't the right group. And there was a fundraising piece that I just was not going to give my life over to fundraising. So I let that project go. But I think a lot of times we end up doing things or looking into things, and we don't really know why we're doing it. And at the time, being a horror writer was nowhere in my mind. There was no
idea. That wasn't in your scope, right?
But right. I was
you were thinking about like documenting stuff, more like recording what's going on than creating a fictional tale.
Exactly. And so I didn't think that I was going to be using this research for that, but that's exactly what I've ended up using it for, is within my work. It comes up again and again, this idea of victims, people who have been victimized, going out and becoming the person who victimizes others. That was the thing that across the board, which I found really interesting in the research, was that whether it was what the so-called inner city gang, or if it was a, a school shooting or a mass shooting that was perpetrated by a young person, there were a number of things in common, including access to guns, because a lot of it is gun violence. But um, the majority of them had either been a victim or had witnessed someone, a close loved one, who was a victim of some form of violence. And within the stories that I've worked on is really kind of looking at, when the abused becomes the abuser, when the victimized becomes the one who goes out and victimizes others, and sort of what leads that, what pressure points we're experiencing to get us to that point.
I think what you go through definitely has lots to do with how you turn out. Like I had a good friend, and he had like a very hardcore Navy dad. So when kids would beat him up at the playground, and he'd come home, he'd be crying and he'd be all scuffed up. His dad would be like, get in the car, take him back to the playground, and be like, "You fight those kids until you win." And as an adult, like he'd be the nicest guy. Something triggered him, he just snapped.
I think a lot of times we are forced to make choices, and this is one of the things that I like to put into my work. We are forced to make choices based on the landscape, right? So when I was young, I grew up in Detroit, and it was at a time where there was a lot of crime in the city. And so I went to school in a suburb, a Catholic school, but in order to be in my neighborhood, you had to know a thing or two. You couldn't you had to be kind of streetwise. And I remember when I was very young having a bike, and I took my bike out to ride it, and another girl on the street wanted to ride it, and she got on, and I let her. But then she never came back with the bike. She like took off, and then I saw her, and then it was a similar thing. Like I went to my mother and I cried, and she was like, "Oh, no, 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 no. You're going to go back and you're going to get your bike." And, she marched me down there, and I had to go, up to the girl and tell her, "That's my bike. I want my bike back." And I was frightened. I was scared. And she gave me back the bike. But, there was a reason that my mother was teaching me that. It was, in a suburb, right?
How old were you at this time?
I was probably about 5. I was very
Okay.
young,
Okay.
but in a safer environment, in an environment where you maybe don't have to be as tough. I don't think that my mother necessarily would have needed to give me that lesson. I think, but now that I'm a mom, and I'm raising my kids in a very different environment than what I was raised in, I can see the pressure that she was under, being in a place where her kids had to be tough in order to survive. And so some of that comes up in my work. It's not all necessarily inner city, but I think I'm very much interested in how the landscape that a person inhabits informs their decisions and the capacity that they have for violence, which I think we all have. I think we all have the capacity for violence.
Well, I think to a certain extent, what people overlook a little bit is like when people do something horrific, whether it's a school shooting or whatever, it's not just that they have access to something, it's also that they're mentally screwed up, because the vast majority of people that have access to something don't do that. And then you have like, case where like I don't know, you saw the thing in like Italy where there's like a like it was like almost like a Tour de France style thing. This guy just got fed up and he just drove through the bikers, killed a bunch of them. And you had like a crazy guy with a knife that went into he went into I think it was a kindergarten, and he killed like 19 kids with a knife. It's like, yeah, so there's something that's messing them up. I
We
mean, I
live
do think this stuff has to be secured, but I'm just saying, you
yeah,
also have crazy people out there.
we live in a violent society. Um, the state, and I don't mean like the state of California, I mean the nation state that we live in, is a violent one, and we are all at any given time we can be the victim of state violence. You know, we have police officers who are armed, who are, you know, who are supposed to, you know, protect and serve. And that works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. Right. And
Right.
sometimes they cannot protect and serve because the weapons that they're going
Well,
against are still
technically they work for you, so they
right.
should make you happy,
Right.
but
But
I don't know,
then
that was lost a long time ago.
right. But then, you know, other times, you know, there are certain marginalized groups within the country who don't see the police as a force of protection and to serve them. So, so I think that there are degrees. I think that we have come to accept so much violence, you know, in our society that I think a lot of times we don't see it. And so that's one of the things that I want to do with my work is to put it on the page and to put it out there so that we can see it.
Okay. So do you do you have like what do you do mainly? Like do you focus on a sole character or a group of people and you try to say, well, this made them become like this, like you see movies like The Warriors and stuff, where it's like, that tribe of people, they think they have to act this way. I know to a certain extent, like, they say your brain's not fully developed until you're 26. So, kids, they're it's like a computer, like an old Commodore 84, it's like or 64, but it's like, they're not operating with like a full cup.
Well, I think for my stories, I usually like to focus in on an individual, and not necessarily that individual has to represent an entire group, but I think that they certainly represent an idea. And so, for instance, in the novella Salamander Justice, that's really about intimate partner violence, what some people call domestic violence. The main character, Vita,
Why do you say some people call it domestic violence? Like you would call it domestic violence? Is there like
no, I'm just
something
saying that
else? Right.
there are different terms for it.
Oh, okay.
I don't think one is, I was just saying domestic so that we realize what I was
I
talking.
was just wondering where you were going with that because you're like some people call it domestic violence. So, like, do you have
It's
a different
it
term for it? Is it
no,
slightly different?
it's referred to under both terms. I don't think that there is a value judgment on either one of them.
Okay.
I just wanted to make it clear that we were talking about the same
Well, the
thing.
value judgment is that domestic violence isn't cool no matter what, whatever it is called. But go ahead. Sorry.
uh, and so Vita, you know, it's that question with Vita. You know, is she the abused or is she the abuser? Sam, the man in the story who is in love with her but hasn't really communicated to her that he's in love with her, sees himself as a very good guy. You know, he eats a plant-based diet. He refers to himself as a vegan. He's a pacifist. And he has these ideas about himself, but the minute that he gets angry with her because he feels betrayed, that those violent tendencies start to show up. But they've also kind of always been there within him because he mistreats another woman who is in his life that he has not put on a pedestal the same way he has with Vita. And so I look at I look at the characters, I look at the individuals. I don't, you know, when I started this story, or when I get an inspiration for a story and I start working on it, I really think about the character, and less about the big idea. The big idea usually comes later in the revision process. So my process is that I become inspired by something, usually in my day-to-day life, and I'll put it out there, I'll work on it. But then when I go back to revise it, I'm thinking to myself, you know, what is this story trying to say? What is the sort of, you know, aboutness of this story? And so that's typically my process. I spend most of my time in revision. The drafting usually is pretty quick. The revision, I believe, is where the author earns their readers. And so I spend most of my time revising. And and that's usually where that little nugget will come to me and say, oh, I think this is what the story is trying to say.
Well, do you think that you like more like revise and edit and smooth out the story so it tells a specific, a tale or agenda or whatever, as opposed to like, like it's just like a loose conglomeration. But it remains more or less the same. You just like polish it up so it aims in a way, or do you think you rewrite it?
No, I don't really rewrite. I think in the draft, I think it's all there in that first draft. It's just that I need to calibrate some things. So there are usually like a phrase, there's usually like a phrase or a line in that first draft that may become in the revision an entire scene. There are little nuggets and opportunities there
Okay.
that
So
I
so
flesh
you
out.
play with what's already there and you just make it like more directed towards what you've decided now is the focus of the work.
I don't know if I decide. I feel more like I discover, because I take some time. So like I'll write it and I'll put it away for a while. Sometimes that could
Right,
be,
but by your discovery, you might decide you're like, this is what I should do.
I think maybe, like as I'm looking at it, I think, oh, it's more like that. It's more like when I go, because I haven't read it in a while. And so when I go back, I'll look at it
Oh,
and
that
I'll,
definitely helps. Yeah.
yeah,
Because it's
it's
a
like
little
I'm
bit
fresh.
distant to you. It's like, yeah, it's hard to do that quick edit when you just wrote it. Because, like, then you just skip over the mistakes you just made.
Right.
But I'm going off on a tangent. Go ahead.
Right. I try to start each revision as a reader. So that's why I have to have some separation from it. Because if I go right back to it, I'm still the writer, right? I'm still the author and I'm still in my head about everything is, and that's where I feel like I do, if I do it that way, that's where I feel like I do that directing or, or deciding. But I feel like if I take some time away from it and it could be like a month or even like if my kids are like my kids have been here all summer. I've taken some breaks from some of my stories that I've just gotten back to this week that I haven't looked at since May. And I go back as a reader and I usually will read it all the way through. And then I go back and I start to mark things. I'm like, oh, I think this is something right here. I may not even decide what that something is, but I know that there's a nugget there, Um, so
And
I
maybe
guess
you'll pull
there's
that
like
out and
some,
like expand on it because you're like, that was a good idea.
yeah, I think it probably is something that's trying to get out there. I do think that these stories kind of exist somewhere and they're just like kind of coming through me. And it's my job to get better at writing and at telling stories in order to be able to tell the story the way that the story intended.
Right.
And that just might be my high-minded kind of like frou-frou way that I stay inspired about what it is that I'm working on.
Do you find it difficult? Like I know that like one thing that people make fun of all the time is like when you have male authors and they'll write female characters and females like no female would act like that. So do you find it difficult when like you do people that are not you? Like either they're like a different sex or they come from a totally different country or whatever.
When I was younger, I started off acting. My mother put me into modeling and acting and pageants and dancing and singing and everything when I was 4 years old. And so for the first 20 years of my life, up until I was out of college and working my first job, I was an actress and I did television commercials. I did a couple of really small parts in films, some stage plays. But the job of the actor, which I think has translated into the writing, is to be an observer. And so I spend a lot of time, not consciously, but sort of unconsciously observing people. So if I'm having a conversation, I am having the conversation, but then there's also some sort of internal thing in me where I am I don't know, it's like I'm connected to that person's, emotions and I can kind of sense some things about them that they may be feeling a certain way, or I may notice some of their mannerisms. And I think all of those make it into the characters. And so I'm able to use that to tell the truth of someone that is very different from me. I've also been married to my husband, and we've been together for well over 20 years. And I think having another adult in the house that you are constantly in communication with, there are just certain things that you're going to pick up on about them. And he's not, there is no character that I've written that is my husband, but there are little tidbits, like little things about him, I think, that make it, and everyone in my family, I think, that make it into the characters. Things that I've observed or I've noticed, or feelings that I've had during conversations with them, my own interpretation of what they're feeling or what they're thinking during discussions. And so I think that, yeah, I think for writers, that's the thing, right? And for anyone who's going to create a character, right, is that observation that you have to have.
Well, whenever I write a character, I almost always base it on somebody that I know or somebody that I've worked with, or so I feel like I'm being more authentic to the persona. But I would like I do probably about 3/4 of my stories in first person. I would never do a female character in first person. I don't think I'm qualified.
That's interesting. I never thought about that. Let me think about that. Yeah, I mean, I did it. And Bridget Has Disappeared, which is the sci-fi story that's in my collection. It actually was published last year in Interzone. And it's actually one of my favorite stories. And he's a man, and he tells this story, in first person, and he's very emotional about his relationship. I think I identify.
Well, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying I don't do it.
Right. No, but I hadn't thought about that until you said it. And I think that I connected with him because he's a journalist. I think I find like I think I
a
find
way
like
that they kind of do something that you're familiar with. So
I
yeah.
think so. And I didn't think about that until you just said it. It had not occurred to me, but I think that that's what I did with him, is I found the me in him. And
Right.
Yusuf is the type of person who's very much like me, where he has to know the answer. He's got this burning question. It's this ongoing mystery with his wife. And he's not the type of person who can just not have an answer. He needs the truth. And I think that I found that part of me in him, and that's why I was able to do it. But I think it's a really good point you raise about finding that truth, or feeling comfortable doing it in first person, which is something that I hadn't thought about before. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like I said, I always try and go with like something I know, or like like I'll ask my girlfriend or ask somebody else. I'm like, how would you react to this? And like, I hate to be called out. Like maybe I'm a little OCD with that, but I remember there was a guy that like, so I've been tattooing for 24 years at this point. And at one point I was like in all the magazines. So this guy from Britain got a hold of me because he just wrote a zombie story. Well, one of the characters is a tattoo artist. So he just wanted me to read it and tell him whether that was like a accurate portrayal of a tattoo artist. It was not even close. It's like no tattoo artist would act. I mean, he didn't listen to me and he did change it. But that's where I'm going with this, is like, sometimes I feel like you've got to do a deep dive into the person before portraying, especially like the more distant it is from what you do in your daily life, the more you have to do your research, or or just not write about it. But if you found, if he does what you've done, that makes sense.
And I think if you're going to reach out to someone to ask them if it's authentic and they tell you it's not, you probably are going to need to change it at some
Well,
point.
no, he did. He totally changed it. So
Okay.
when the book came out, it was Winsome is, it was Drop Dead Gorgeous. When it came out, he changed that portion of it. So
Okay.
it wasn't like he published it and they asked me what I thought.
Okay.
He sent me a rough draft.
Oh, got it. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm glad he listened to you.
So what made the transition for you between being like a what you were like an actor, were you a newscaster, is that what you said?
No, no. So, so I was an actor when I was younger, and then I did that all the way up until and through college. Actually, I moved to New York and went to Columbia. That's where I met my husband. And I was still acting, doing television commercials there. And then when it was time for me to graduate, I wanted to get a job that was a, you know, like a 9 to 5 job. I was tired of auditioning and, you know, going after parts and having
Up
this
and down.
schedule that was, yeah, it was not a you know, it was really really high and then really really low, right? And there was no like structure in the day. And I had interned in production when I was in college, and I enjoyed it. And so I made the transition after college to work behind the scenes in production, not in front. I think I was done with being in front of the camera at that point, because I had been doing it since I was 4. And so I worked for a couple of years in New York on a couple of productions. I went to grad school. We moved to LA, went to grad school for journalism, and came out and worked as a journalist for a number of years. But then when I had my daughter, I did not want that deadline pressure that you have from working in television production. And so I continued to work for a little while taking care of her, but then I started to write. And when I realized
Were you like a journalist for like magazines and newspapers?
no, I worked. So I worked for network news.
Okay.
And then I left there and worked for a PBS television show. And so I did that for a number of years. And then I worked on the documentary treatment that ended up not being a documentary. And then after that, I just started taking care of my daughter and writing when I wasn't taking care of her. And I have a son now too. And I'm with them. And when I'm not with them, I write. And I don't know where it's headed. You know, I just, you know, I've made this transition into horror, and I am, you know, enjoying putting out work. I'm enjoying working on things. And I have a couple of longer manuscripts that I'm working on, but I really enjoy writing short work. I love being able to begin and end and get it off of my desk. And send it out into the world. I really enjoy that process.
Do you try and maintain the continuity between stuff, like like this scenario happened in the same like universe or whatever is this scenario?
Within the stories within the collection,
Yeah.
no, there are 13 tales in here, and they're all very different. I think the thing that brought them together was that they were transgressive, that many of the characters are breaking out of something, some sort of mold or some sort of idea or some sort of role that they are supposed to play in society. But they're each their own, you know, little world. And some of them were in magazines, and some of them were in anthologies, and some of the anthologies were themed. Like I Am Goddess was in an anthology last year that was put out by Sinister Smile Press.
Okay.
Sinister Smile Press was If I Die Before I Wake, Volume 7,
Okay.
Tales of Savagery and Slaughter. And so
Was there savagery and slaughter in that story?
yes. So that
No,
story.
no spoilers, but
So you know, I was saying that's what I was saying, is that I have some stories that are horror but are not speculative, and that's one of them. Lyra, she is in a bad relationship, and she makes some decisions by the end that just there's a woman holding a knife on the cover of the book, and I feel like this character fits right into that mold of where she takes things. She yeah, it's a bit of an origin story for her. I think she becomes a bit of
Why do you see they're not speculative fiction? Like I remember my editor, like I have like a little bit of horror, a little bit of adventure, a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of whatever, and he was like, "Oh, it's a speculative fiction." I'm like, "What the fuck is that?" Like, "Oh, well, it's a little bit of everything." You just like it doesn't clearly fall into a genre, so it's kind of a mishmash. Are you saying it was more like the stuff that you did that was not speculative fiction had a specific theme or a specific thing that it more conformed to?
Well, for speculative, the way that I define it, and this may not be the way others do, but it has some element to it that is not of this world. And so there's going to be something in it that either powers the characters or is a part of the plot or the story that cannot happen in our day-to-day reality. And horror can encompass that, but it can also be, Lyra was tired of dealing with her boyfriend or her husband, and she pulls out the garden shears and she cuts them, and then she turns into this, she's like a pre-slasher,
Right.
essentially. And so there's no, you can interpret some of it to say maybe maybe she was possessed, or maybe there was, but that one to me was a
But
straight.
it's not a clear aspect of the story. So like you can't say, well, this definitely was that.
Yeah, that with that story, I think it's ambiguous. She was getting, her beauty treatments, and the mantra, the I am goddess that she's chanting to herself during the beauty treatments kind of empowers her. I wouldn't say empowers her, because I don't know that it's a power move that she does, but it definitely emboldens her, and it makes her not as accepting of the treatment that she's been experiencing from her husband. So there's a certain aspect to that where you could say, oh, maybe there is some sort of speculative nature to the treatments that she's getting, the beauty treatments, but I don't know. I think she just was fed up. I think she was just tired of dealing with her husband, and he wasn't overtly, like, he wasn't hitting her, he wasn't punching her, but he certainly was making her feel awful and like she was less than, and that he was going to
It's a
control.
little more emotional and psychological abuse than like physical abuse. Yeah.
Exactly. And coercive control, because he was making her come to him, even though she worked and he worked, making her come to him to ask for money, and to feel like he controlled the money and how the money was going to be spent in the home.
So
And
there's a little bit of a narcissist too.
yes, there was a lot of that going on. And
Okay.
so, I I think it's a horror story in the sense that, she sort of is transgressor. She breaks out of this mold, of this role of what society has told her she has to do. I think that the mantra that she was chanting in the beauty treatments emboldened her, but I don't think it was speculative. That's not
Right.
how I would define it anyway.
No, that's interesting. That like not of this world aspect. That's yeah. I didn't realize that's how some people look at it. And like, all my stuff has like a little bit of sci-fi in it. So that might be why like the label of speculative fiction is clamped on it.
Right.
But
Oh yeah. For sci-fi, definitely. But that's what I think that's what I love about horror. I think that is the thing about horror that has drawn me into it. And I've always been drawn to this aspect of it, is that it can exist, and it does very much exist in this world, and we can use this work to highlight that and to have discussions about it. When you look at, for instance, just even growing up in Detroit, there was always a threat of violence. It just was a high crime city. And so we had the crime within the city, but then I also was not allowed to call the police because the police could come and brutalize us because we were African American. And so I was just, when I was growing up, there was this constant state of fear, right? None of that is speculative. None of that is otherworldly.
Were the police very racist? Were they just like super judgmental? You know, like what was the biggest thing they had to deal with if the cops showed up? Are they just going to jump to judgment? You know, even if you're innocent.
Yeah, well, yeah, for African American people historically in this country, we are and have always been the victims of state violence, and in typically the enforcers of that is going to be the police, right? And so the entire prison industrial complex, police brutality, you know, what happened to George Floyd had been happening in cities across the country, and certainly in Detroit when I was growing up. There was one of the men who was killed was a man by the police, was a man named Malice Green, and it was a big case in Detroit when I was growing up. And so when we fast forward to George Floyd, for most African American people, that was a continuation of what we have been experiencing. And so when I was growing up, I was cautioned that I had to use 911 sparingly. I had to use 911 for medical emergencies, not for a shooting outside. I couldn't use it for, the person next door who is, throwing, a glass at her husband or something, because in cases like that, you don't know when they come whether or not they will turn on you. Because you're African American and because you are, poor, and because you live in a high crime neighborhood, you just never know. You don't want to add that into the mix of
Right.
what is already going on.
Right.
And then also, if it's ever found out that you called the police on someone who was not doing things the way that they were supposed to in the
Yeah,
neighborhood,
then you're a snitch, yeah.
right, there's retribution for that
Yeah.
as well. So there was just a constant state of fear when I was growing up, in the neighborhood that I lived in, which was juxtaposed to the suburb that I went to school in. And then all of the places that I was, modeling and acting was out in the suburbs and the nicer neighborhoods. But that's horror,
Right.
for African American people, the entire trajectory of our experience in the United States involves terror, in state terror, right? If you look at the Jim Crow South, if you look at the entire reason for the civil rights movement, right? That we are victims
You
of terror.
see the show Lovecraft Country?
Yes. Yes.
So I thought that first episode was really effective because you didn't realize how incredibly powerful some of the stuff was until you saw the episode. You're like, wow, man.
Yes, yes. And it's interesting because, I grew up in a high crime, so-called inner city, neighborhood within Detroit. And I now live in a suburb in the East Bay of San Francisco. And the town that I'm in is a former sundown town, which is one of the things that
Oh,
was
really?
yeah, which was one of the things that was highlighted in Lovecraft Country. And so I wouldn't
But you
say
probably didn't have the Shogun show up and like eat the police and
right.
that would be cool, but yeah.
That was an unexpected twist, right? But well placed, but unexpected.
I thought that was great. That was my favorite part of it when they show up, the Shogun show up. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
But in the area that I live now, I wouldn't say that we live in a constant state of fear the same way that I did when I was growing up, but we still have to be mindful of where we are, right, as African American people in a predominantly white environment that is historically a sundown town and is a generally closed society, right, within this little pocket that I live in. And so there are just certain things that you just have to be aware of. And so that is the thing about horror, both the speculative and the non-speculative, that I enjoy, because it can give voice to all of these things, right? Whether it's the ghosts in your house, the demons in the basement, or
Demons
the
and other
racist
people.
neighbor,
Yeah.
the racist neighbor that just called the cops on you, right?
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of ground. Like, I think that what gives every story is strength is how well it's told. So it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's like something that people have never heard before or whatever. It's how well it's done. But I don't want to keep you here all day. So how can people get a hold of you? How can they see your stuff? And
Um,
how can they give you money?
I think the best place is my website, tamikathompson.com. TAM is in Mary, IKA, Thompson, THOMPSON, tamikathompson.com. And I have a blog and a newsletter, Tamika Talks Terror. I do not have a podcast. I have no plans to have a podcast. My hat is off to you and to everyone who does this. It is a lot to put these productions together, but I have my books there. I have my short work there. All of my social media is there. I think that's the best place for people to find me. I recently joined Blue Sky, and
What is Blue Sky?
Blue Sky is the Twitter/X alternative that's like still invite only. So I'm feeling all exclusive.
Oh, they come up with stuff all the time. There's vines, there's threads, and like a lot of it's just a flash in the pan.
Yeah,
But
exactly. I'm figuring it out though. But all the social media is on there too. So
okay, are you on Twitter or Instagram?
yeah,
You
so
know,
I'm on Instagram, Twitter. I'm on Slasher. Have you heard of Slasher?
I've
I'm
never heard of Slasher.
get on Slasher. It's for horror lovers. Slasher TV.
Okay.
They have their own app, and you can go on and you can post things. I post things. I post what I'm watching, what I'm reading, if I have an event coming up. And it's just for horror lovers, people who love film, books. You should check that out.
I'll
Um,
definitely check it out. Do you have a couple recommendations you want to toss out, like before we end here, like so people know what to look for?
Recommendations for
Movies, books,
yeah.
Netflix series.
Well, I have an entire required reading list on my blog, because when I was at StokerCon this year, I moderated
The one in Pittsburgh.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's how I made it here. We got the top and yeah, and so I moderated the Black Women in Horror panel, and I put together an entire required reading list that has Black women in horror on it. And it's got, there were 6 women nominated for Stoker Awards who were African American this year. Or I shouldn't say African American. I'm going to say Black, because I don't know if they're all African American. But Jewel Gomez, Linda Addison, RJ Joseph, Samiko Salson, like all of these people, I have their books on this list. And I think that people should check it out because they're writing wonderful things. Many of them that are on that list are indie horror writers, and the indie horror scene, I think, is where it's at right now. So I think people should check out that's my recommendation, is my required reading list.
Well, I think a lot of people, like, less now, but they used to think that, like, you're in a major label or you're a major publisher or whatever, that means you're good. No, it doesn't. It's some of the best stuff comes out from indie, and then it just gets swallowed up by the majors, and they usually rob you along the way.
Well, I think part of that is that and I can only speak for myself, but the editors and the publishers that I have met along the way who have published my work have all been really amazing, and they care about the quality of the product. They are authors themselves, and I think that makes a difference.
I think it definitely does. Like, my current publisher is Dave Wilson from Crossroad Press, and him being an author, I mean, you can tell the difference.
You can tell. I mean, they're not going to send you ridiculous contracts to start, right? and they care about the promotion of the work. They care about the quality of it. They care about the cover art. Madness Heart Press. I've worked with Unnerving, Sinister Smile Press. Like all of these guys that I've worked with have been really fabulous. And I think that that's really why, one of the major reasons why the indie horror scene is thriving is because the people who are putting the work out care about the work and care about the authors. And I'm not saying that you don't get that in New York. I'm saying that it's amazing that you can get that outside of New York.
Right. Well, I don't know. New York, in a way, New York is very like regimented. Like nobody gives a fuck, and then all of a sudden, somebody that they deem important, like says you're good, and then all of a sudden you're the God's gift to writing. But like maybe you're amazing, just nobody important noticed.
Well, I think that it worked. I think that it's probably a great place for some books, right? I think
Right.
it's a great place for books that can be marketed to the readers that those publishing houses are going after. One of the authors in the books that's on the list is Erin Adams Jackal, and she her work was traditionally published, and it's an amazing book. And that I think that the point that I'm making is that if you're not publishing with the houses in New York, you can still get a quality product out. I think that you can still work with some amazing people and be proud of your book when you're selling it.
Right. Yeah, well, word of mouth goes a long way, and everybody needs to review stuff. Reviews help so much. But thank you very much for doing this podcast. Thank you for sharing with me. Do you have anything else that you want to bring up? Anything you want to mention?
No, I'm just so happy that you had me on. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad we met at StokerCon. Are you coming next year? I hope to see you.
No, now next year it's in California. So I know that's way closer for you. That's way farther from me. Yeah. So I doubt, like I did 4 conventions here. I did Dallas AuthorCon, I did Cares and Scares, I did StokerCon, I did KillerCon. So
wow, you've been busy.
Yeah. So I don't know, but yeah, I'm glad I met you. I'm glad we did this. And like I said, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being on here.